Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bella Gamer, and now we're kind of getting into some of the not the hit pieces I feel for Howl the Wild, but still some of the most interesting ones. Honestly, the archetype I'm the most interested in is the one we're talking about today, which is the Swarmkeeper. It's interesting to say the least, but before we hop into it exactly, go ahead, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more Pathfinder content. I'm releasing videos every day, as well as I'll be covering PaizoCon later this month. So if you want to get any of the news as it comes, this is definitely the channel to be on. And if you could leave a like, that would help the channel a lot. It really helps get the videos out to more people, as you know, the algorithm just doesn't really like tabletop content that's not D&D. So if you want more tabletop games to get out there, a like would help as well. So let's go ahead and talk about the Swarmkeeper. The Swarmkeeper dedication is kind of a letdown, if I'm gonna be honest. So what the Swarmkeeper is you have a swarm in your body that you can exude out of your body, and then it does swarm things. It can be in other creatures' squares, and it affects all creatures in its squares with its abilities. The problem is this feels more like a spell, and it feels like a worse spell than most spells tend to be, and that's a problem. It does give you some unique abilities, and there are some fascinating things you can do with the archetype, but you'll see as we look over it what some of my problems and complications, I guess, are with it. First of all, let's go ahead and look at the dedication. So the dedication requires that you're trained in nature. It isn't an uncommon dedication, but that's honestly, it's only uncommon, I guess, is how weird it is, because for no particular reason is it like game breaking or potentially world breaking by what I would consider most standards. So it's definitely an interesting one nonetheless. So what the dedication does do is it gives you your swarm. You get your swarm right out the gate, which is kind of cool. And for a level 2 dedication feat, this is somewhat impactful. When you select this feat, you gain access to a swarm that you can cast out of yourself with the Swarm Forth ability, which allows it to move to an adjacent space. It is a large swarm, so it takes up, a two by two squares on the grid. And as well, when you summon it and when you sustain it every round, it can move. Now, it has a movement speed of 15 feet and a climb speed of 15 feet, which means that there's a lot of places it can go, but it's not particularly fast. But you heard earlier, right? Sustain. And before we get into that aspect of it as well, this is kind of an animal companion in the sense that it takes up an animal companion slot. So you can't have a swarm and a normal animal companion at the same time unless you have an ability that allows you to have for more than one animal companion, like the Beastmaster archetype, which is probably the one we're going to cover next. Though not next video, but the next archetype that we'll end up covering here on the channel. And you're also immune to the effect, and up to 5 willing creatures you anoint with their pheromones are immune to their damage as well. So the exact things it's immune to are grapples, prone, restrained, and mental effects. So that's what it has. It also has resistance equal to your level, and it has weakness equal to your resistance equal to your level of physical damage types, which is pretty good, and weakness up to your level in splash damage, which, to be fair, there's not actually a ton of enemies that use splash damage. And I guess it's actually splash damage and area damage, which area damage is a different thing, and so there's just going to be some things your swarm's not going to be good against. Now, the swarm can be attacked as inferred by the resistances, but it uses your statistics for defenses, which is strange. Statistics for defenses, I mean, does it just use your AC? I think so. The reason why is any damage that would be dealt to the swarm is dealt to you instead, though you take damage only once from any ability that includes both you and your swarm in the area of effect. So you take whatever the greater damage is. If it's an area of effect thing, you're just going to probably take more because your swarm takes extra damage from area effect things. So you share it's like a summon, right? You share HP with your swarm. It uses your defensive statistics, so I guess it's not any likely, and I guess it benefits from your armor stuff too. I don't know. This is a very strange one. It says your statistics, and when it comes to interpretations, everyone has an opinion, so I guess people will let me know in the comments below. But I mentioned sustain earlier, so I'm going to read this next part so that there's no confusions as to what I'm interpreting or what anyone else is interpreting. So, swarm forth. Your swarm is in your body as a requirement to use this action. So, in order to exude it, you have to have it in you. Duh. Your swarm boils forth from your body into a space adjacent to yours. Its space can overlap yours, which makes sense. It remains separate from you until the end of your next turn, but you can sustain the effect up to a minute. The effect also ends if you end your turn more than 60 feet away from the swarm, so there is a proximity thing as well. When you use Swarm Forth, and each time you sustain the effect, you can have the swarm stride. So when you use Swarm Forth, the two actions, it can stride, and when you sustain it, it gets a stride. That's kind of nice because you can sustain the swarm, and it can move out at the like you get some utility out of it, but that's also kind of a bad thing, but we'll get into that here in a moment. When the swarm forth ends, the swarm disperses into individual creatures. While dispersed, it can no longer be used for actions or be targeted, and the insects return to you and nest in your body again. This typically takes a minute unless you're extremely far away for whatever reason. And then, while your swarm is out, you have access to Bite and Sting. Bite and Sting allows you, each creature in your swarm space takes a d4 piercing damage with a basic reflex saving throw against your class DC or spell DC, whichever is higher. At 4th level and every even level thereafter, the damage increases by a d4. So every even level, it goes up in it by a d4. A d4 is not bad, but what makes Bite and Sting good is because it's based on a basic saving throw, it's likely to always deal damage every time you do it. Now at level 2, it's not a lot. You have an average damage of 2 to 3, and if the enemy saves, which is almost as likely to do as if it fails, it takes half. So on average, you're looking at either 1 to 3 damage on average every time you use this, but it's almost always going to do damage unless the enemy crit succeeds for whatever reason. Now, for if you're not a spellcasting class, your class succeed tends to be a little bit weaker, but like I said, unless the enemy crit succeeds, which is a bit more on the rare side, you're always likely to do damage. Now, the damage is also somewhat multiplicative, and what I mean by that is for every creature in your creature's area, space, it just increases the amount of damage it can do. So if there's one creature, it's 1 to 3. If there's 2 creatures, it's 2 to 6. And 3 creatures is 3 to 9. You see what I mean? Every time you add a creature, it adds more damage. And then when you go up every even level, you add a little bit more damage. But see, the problem is that every 2 levels, you're adding a d4, which is on average, again, 2 to 3 damage. But enemies, every 2 levels, are gaining on average close to 10 HP. So while your damage increases by 2 or 3 points, the enemy's HP is increasing by, likely anyway, 20 health, which means it's not a lot. And enemy HP starts outscaling the damage from Bite and Sting by a pretty significant amount. And so this is the problem with Swarmkeeper, is it takes up an animal companion slot, but unlike an animal companion, you have to sustain this one. And while that wouldn't be a problem if you could like command it like normal, that's not how this one works. You're not commanding your swarm. Your swarm gives you access to swarm abilities that you can utilize in a fight. So you sustain it, it can move, but then if you want it to bite, you'll need to spend 2 actions. So in order to use your swarm on the first turn, it's a 3 action ability to make it bite someone. and summon it in the first turn. On every other turn, it's essentially 2 actions to make it bite someone, because you have to sustain it if you want it to stick around for another round, and you use an action to bite the enemies, or use one of the other feats that we're going to talk about here in another moment. But like, I'm spending a lot of time talking about just the dedication feat, but it has so much gunk in it that just makes it feel like it doesn't work. Why use a swarm in comparison to an animal companion? Animal companion, you don't have to sustain it. Every time you give it an action, it gets 2 actions, which is good action economy. And animal companions are just likely to do more damage. Yeah, they miss, but when they hit, they're likely to do more than, at level 2 to 3 damage, but at higher levels, their damage just scales genuinely better in most situations. There are some exceptions, but it just feels bad. If the sustained action was more of a command, I would like this. Or honestly, just don't make it sustained. Remove the sustaining necessity, and then if you want it to move, you have to spend an action to bite. I feel like that would be equally fine without the pressure of needing to sustain, because there's just a lot of classes out there that just don't have the action economy to sustain. So it's kind of frustrating how, like, I really like the idea of Swarmkeeper. I think it's the one I was most excited for, but looking it over, I just feel like there's just better things to do with your actions. Now, there are some situations where I feel like its damage is not bad if you get multiple enemies kind of in a small zone. Like, if you get 4 enemies who are adjacent in a perfect square, that's kind of like perfect territory for a swarm. But that's just the only situation where I find that this is really useful. But let's go ahead and take a look at the other feats, and maybe some of these feats will help with this and make it better. So at level 4, we get the Aphid Flash. This one has a frequency of once per round, which is silly because it's a flourish, so of course it's once per round. And it has a requirement that your swarm is outside your body, which makes a ton of sense. So your swarm emits a bright flash, much like aphid beetles or any other kind of firefly-esque kind of creatures. Each creature in its space must succeed a fort save against your class DC or spell DC, or be dazzled for 1 round. The swarm then glows with the light of a torch until it returns to your body. So this one has an interesting effect that each creature in its space must succeed a fort save or become dazzled. That's actually pretty good. Now, if they succeed, which honestly they're as likely to do or not, it depends on if it's their high save or not. Being dazzled for a round is really good, and you can dazzle them round after round if you want, which does reduce their overall ability to hit. That's genuinely pretty good. I don't really have a problem with this one. It's just, deciding, are you going to do damage this round, or are you going to use Aphid Flash, or are you going to do nothing with your actual character and just use your swarm for the entire round? That's kind of a problem. Now, the Flash is only effective in the space in which it occupies. So your swarm honestly needs to move, and it's so slow that enemies can easily outrun it. Now, obviously, this is meant to be used in tighter quarters where there's less mobility. That's where the swarm really exceeds. That's kind of an aspect of Swarmkeeper that I'll talk about later, where Swarmkeeper is not necessarily bad. It's just situational, and you're just not going to use it every round. But the problem is, I don't know when you would use Swarm in comparison to like an animal companion. But anyway, so if the Flash is pretty good, honestly. Every enemy that becomes dazzled literally is just less effective. They deal potentially less damage. So that being the case, not a bad one. Pyon Sting is actually probably my favorite level 4 ability. This one is also a flourish and also an action. And what you're noticing is any of your specific swarm abilities are flourishes. Now, that is not something I necessarily have a problem with, except this is your action. So this is a flourish that your character is making. So you can't use any of your character's flourishes with your swarm's flourishes, which is a problem. But the Pyon Sting, and I think what it was they were going to just make them once per round, but they decided to change it to add the Flourish trait instead, and Aphid Flash just didn't get it. That's my assumption of what happened, because you don't see the once per round frequency on any of these other ones. But Pyon Sting is really cool. Each creature in your swarm space must make a fort save against your class DC or spell DC, or they take a d6 persistent poison damage. And any creatures that critically fail this save are enfeebled 1 for as long as the poison persists. This damage increases every 4 levels after this one. So at 8th and every 4 after, it goes up by another d6. This one's pretty good. Pyon Sting is something I can see wanting to utilize, because it's just go out, hopefully of the group of enemies that your swarm is attacking, one of them fails, and now you're generating an additional d6 damage onto them until they make the save. And you can keep just proccing this poison on them as often as you want to use the action. It's pretty good. Not many enemies are immune to poison, though there are a fair number that are, like most undead. So not the most useful, but just the extra damage potential. And if I'm being honest, this works almost better. I say almost because technically at this level, it's about the same amount of damage. So the Bite and Sting might be better, especially like at 6th level, where it technically will just end up doing more damage typically than the poison would. But at 8th level, then it kind of balances again. So I don't know. It goes back and forth. The Pyon Sting is good. I like it. I think it's something that's interesting, and it pairs really well with this particular archetype. Also, at level 4, we have Weaver's Web. Probably my least favorite, because this is one of the few things that feels like it actually can mess with your allies as well. But whenever you use this action, which also has the Flourish trait and requires your swarm to be outside of you, wherever your swarm ends its turn, it fills all the surfaces in its space with sticky webs that last for a minute. These webs are difficult terrain. A creature that ends its turn in the web must succeed at a reflex save or be immobilized until it escapes. The web's DC and escape DC are equal to the higher of your class or spell DC. The swarm is immune to its own webs. So the swarm is immune to its webs, but you and your team is not, because the pheromone ability that we talked about earlier only works against the swarm's damage. So that being the case, Weaver's Web is honestly can be really bad, can be really good. It can also let you set up traps before a fight necessarily. So it does have some interesting uses. It's just something that, like, in combat is not necessarily as good, but it can block out areas. I mean, Weaver's Web is not bad. It's my least favorite of the level 4s, but I think it has a lot of potential uses depending on the kind of environment you're in. If you're in a cave, it can actually be pretty nasty, because it can block off big areas that make it harder for the enemies to move. But with combat not lasting as long, it like 3 to 5 rounds at most. I feel like setting up traps is not as good in combat as it is like out of combat. So this one is as good as you have prep time, I feel like. So potentially really good, or potentially kind of like more of an issue for your teammates, depending on the situation. So yeah, there are different types of classes that can ignore difficult terrain that I feel can make even better use of this one. So Weaver's Web is better on some characters than others, but yeah, I don't know. I prefer the Pyon Sting personally, but to each their own. At level 6, we get Distracting Bites, which is probably one of the better uses for this particular archetype, especially if you want to go a rogue Swarmkeeper, because this actually gives you some good opportunities. So what it does is whenever a creature takes damage from the Bite and Sting, it becomes off guard to your first strike you make against it in the same turn. So essentially, you would sustain the swarm, bite the enemy, and then your last action would be to strike. The enemy's off guard to you, so you get your sneak attack off pretty easily, and it's almost always going to go off because, as I said, it's a basic reflex saving throw, and all they need to do is just take damage from your swarm. So this is a really easy way, as long as your rogue doesn't need to move and the enemy remains adjacent to you, to get your sneak attack off every turn, every round, and do a fair amount of damage. Would it be as much damage as doing 2 strikes? Yeah, actually, because your sneak attack would make up for if the enemy was off guard for any other reason. And compared to like fainting, which has a chance of just not working, this feels like a better feint, though technically it's a feint that would require 2 actions if you want to do it the next round, because you have to sustain the swarm. So yeah, it's good, I would say. Distracting Bites works really, really well, especially with a rogue or any other class that really makes good use of enemies being off guard. Even a fighter, this gives you essentially a higher crit chance, though your higher accuracy would make striking twice probably more efficient. But I can at least see it working in that way. Also at level 6, we get Mobile Swarm. This one's a really good one because it makes your swarm speeds increase to 20 feet. So its land and climb speed goes to 20 feet. And it gains a swim speed up to 20 feet. So depending on the type of campaign you're in, you might have to take this one. But just increasing its movement speed by 5 feet is genuinely pretty good. It makes it so that you're more likely to get the swarm where it needs to go. Mobile Swarm is really good. Carried with the Swarm is our level 8 feat, and it's actually a lot better, and it makes the Swarm stuff work a lot better. Essentially, you just become a moving Swarm, kind of. But whenever your Swarm strides with you in its space, you stay in the same relative space as the Swarm, but you move with it. Because you're moving voluntarily on a command, this movement from you still triggers reaction, so it still can be hit by reactive strike. But it's a good way to keep, like, in the rogue situation we were talking about before, the rogue wants to continuously be inside their swarm, they can do so easily while being able to be in range of their enemies, which is very solid. Now, you even fly with your swarm if your swarm gets a fly speed, which we can get in a little bit later, which is kind of cool. But if you don't have a fly speed, you fall at the end of the movement. So that's something to keep in mind. But that also means technically you get to climb and swim with them as well. So that being the case, you climb. If your hands are free, you can then latch onto the wall with a grab an edge reaction, I'm supposing, to maintain your position. This could get you up onto a cliff a lot more easily, which I think is very good. And with the swim speed, this can essentially give you a swim speed if you don't have one. So carried with the swarm pairs perfectly with mobile swarm and just gives your character a lot more options to move and makes the swarm feel a little bit better, because now, at the very least, when you're sustaining the action, you're also getting to move in the round, which offers us some action efficiency, which I really like. Does that make it better? Not necessarily, but it definitely helps, which is something I appreciate. Also at level 8, we have the Sportal Boore Choke, which actually is a very strong ability and makes the Swarm feel a lot better. It sucks that Swarm doesn't feel good until level 8, but that's just kind of the situation we're left with. So what does it do? It's a flourish trait. It requires your Swarm is outside of your body. Essentially what happens is your Spore attempts to force their way into the mouth of the creatures in the Swarm. Ugh. Each creature in the Swarm takes 4d4 piercing damage, depending on a fort save against the higher of your class or spell DC. The damage increases every odd level after this by an additional d4. Every even level after this by an additional d4. So at 10, it'll go up by 1d4, and at 12, yada yada. Regardless of the result of the save, the creature is temporarily immune to the choke for an hour. So you can only really use this on, well, technically, as many enemies as you can hit at a time, but once per enemy on a battlefield. So what happens? Crit success, nothing happens. They keep the bugs out of their mouth. Success, they take half damage and are sickened 1 as it spits out most of the offending Sportal bugs. The sickened on success is absolutely crazy. And half damage, so like at this level, this does almost the same damage as this does do the same damage as your Bite and Sting. So this can kind of replace Bite and Sting at least once per enemy, because at level 8, your Bite and Sting does 4d4. So there's really no reason not to do this other than maybe the enemy has a high fortitude in comparison to reflex, which is something that you'll have to suss out in order to figure out. If they fail, they take the full damage and are sickened 1. And if they crit fail, the creature takes double the damage and is sickened 2. So sickened 1 on success is absolutely crazy. That's good. That this this should be your opener more often than not. Even though it doesn't do a lot of damage, even though the damage hasn't scaled particularly well up to this level, Sicken 1 is an insanely good penalty to impose on your enemies. So, that being the case, this is really good. Now, of course, they're immune to an hour, so once they get rid of the Sicken condition, they're good, but they do need to spend an action to do so to retch, and that's if they beat your class or spell DCs. So that being the case, this is actually good. Honestly, I would have had much less to argue about if this was the initial ability, but obviously Sicken 1 on success is insanely powerful, especially at level 2. So that being the case, I like this one. I think it's really good. Even though the damage isn't high, I think it's a really good utility ability. So that being the case, and hey, if you had Pyon Sting at this point, now your Pyon Sting does 2d6 poison damage, persistent poison damage if they fail to save. So yeah, this is pretty good. And also, I should mention, any kind of frightened or any kind of sickened effect you do does make pretty much all your other abilities more effective by reducing enemy saves. So again, an insanely good ability and makes this archetype work a lot better. At level 10, we get Veil of Bugs. This is actually pretty good. You and your allies gain lesser cover when in your swarm spaces, so everyone just gets a bonus to their AC. It's pretty solid. Not good for your shield wielding allies, but hey, if you're going with the carried with the swarm play style where you're always moving with your swarm, your AC is now just effectively one higher anytime you have your swarm out, which is really good. So Veil of Bugs, also really good. Also something I wish we had gotten maybe a little earlier, as even though, yeah, it's kind of good, I feel like it would have made the swarm feel better earlier. Next up, we have at level 12, Buzzing Death Cicadas, which is very cool. Now you can see here it's Flourish, but it doesn't have the prerequisite that your swarm, or the requirement that your swarm's outside your body, because this feat actually does two things. Well, two things. One hand, two things. First of all, the Death Cicadas in your swarm gives your swarm effectively a 20-foot fly speed. That's pretty good, honestly. I really like that. That's a very solid ability. And then you gain access to the Death Drone ability. Now, this ability technically requires that your swarm is outside of your body. And this one also has the auditory and mental. I don't know why it has Flourish here and Flourish in the feat itself. That doesn't make sense, but whatever. It visually, when it's in the feet, it makes it easier to see. So I'm happy with that regardless. The cicada make a droning sound. Each creature in your swarm space takes 6d4 mental damage and must make a will save against your class or spell DC, whichever is higher. If they crit succeed, nothing happens. On success, they take half the damage, and on failure, they take the full damage and are frightened one and take a -2 circumstance penalty to perception checks that require hearing. And on crit failure, the creature takes double damage, is frightened 2, and is deafened until the start of your next turn. This is an insanely good ability, and it targets will, which is good because that means now, with most of our abilities, we can target every save an enemy has, which is insanely good. Also, this does mental damage, and it does the same damage as our Bite and Sting, which at this level would be 64. So you can use this instead of Bite and Sting to do damage, and unlike our Sportal Boores, this one doesn't make the enemy immune after using it. So you can use this instead of Bite and Sting to do damage, and to make the enemy frightened if they fail. Worst case scenario, they succeed, and you would have done the same amount of damage as your Bite and Sting anyway. So this honestly just replaces Bite and Sting, other than the fact that Bite and Sting specifically targets reflex saving throws. So it might not be good against a specific type of enemy, but if the will's not the high one, then you probably should be using this one more often than not. And you just make enemies frightened consistently. This is what the Swarmkeeper is about. This is what makes the Swarmkeeper good, is even though they don't do a high amount of damage, they can do consistent damage and consistently keep enemies debuffed, which is what you'd expect from a swarm. And, all kinds of things. So I really like Buzzing Death Cicadas. There's no reason not to select it if you have this as like your free archetype. And it's overall just pretty good. And at level 14, we get Expand the Swarm. This makes your swarm into huge instead of large, which gives you a much bigger area, which means its damage is actually much higher multiplicative, because rather than having a max potential enemies of 4, we have a max potential enemies of 9. 8 if you're choosing to be in your swarm, it would be 3. Similarly, if your swarm was large. So that's a massive increase and is insanely good because you just cover a bigger area now. The area around you becomes a real big danger zone if you get close to a bunch of enemies. You heard my complaints. I did have some good things to say about the Swarmkeeper. Let's talk about the practical use of Swarmkeeper. Swarmkeeper is an archetype dedication you would select that you would not base your character around. I don't think using Swarmkeeper in every fight would ever be a good idea. Now, that's actually just not necessarily a bad thing. There's many archetypes that are just not super useful in every situation. In fact, there's plenty that are just non-combat based, which are good outside of combat. So, Swarmkeeper, I feel like, isn't bad. Where it most excels, where the biggest part where Swarmkeeper really succeeds is when you're in a situation where it's tight quarters. So in rooms, hallways, tunnels, a fair number of places, I have to add. It's really good where the enemies don't have the ability to move a lot. This is a really good ability to just drop on them, to force them to have to interact with it. And it can do some really good debuffs. Its damage falls off really hard, in all honesty. A lot of enemy HP scaling gets so high, and the damage from this increase just isn't high enough that the damage potential from the abilities, which makes Bite and Sting just not effective and not worth the action cost eventually, kind of bad. I mean, like, if you want guaranteed damage, like, yeah, this technically does better than alchemical vials, but you don't have to, well, potentially spend 2 actions if you have a quick bomber. But regardless, like, Bite and Sting is good because it can do consistent damage. I just, the part that makes me struggle is, like, if you're a spellcaster, then your swarm is not doing anything on turns that you want to cast a spell unless you have a 1-action spell. And if you do want to do something with your swarm, then you just can't cast any spells in that turn. And many classes really can't really make full use of this. Gunslinger can't because they need to reload, which is extra action economy they have to worry about. Magus, many classes. There are some classes that this works with better. When I ask myself, is Swarmkeeper better than just having an animal companion that eventually just gives you extra actions in your turn because it'll do something when you don't command it to do something, or if you do command it, it does get 2 actions? I feel like animal companion more often than not just is better. And that's not even just for damage purposes. I mean, your animal companion can attempt to flank enemies. Your animal companion does get abilities. It can attempt to trip an enemy or grab onto an enemy, do all these kinds of things. And on average, just do more damage. Now, yeah, sure, it's harder for your animal companions to dazzle an enemy, for instance, but I think there might be some that do, or do persistent poison damage, or sicken an enemy, or frighten an enemy, though there are some animal companions that can do those things. It just feels not as good. And to be honest, Swarmkeeper is not an archetype I would even bother selecting until maybe level 8, when you can get carried with the Swarm. Because, well, at level 6 to pick up the dedication, but then at level 8 you can select carried with the Swarm, because at least then you get a little bit of movement if you're choosing to be inside your swarm, which, is pretty good. And after that point, you get Sportal Boore, you get the Death Cicadas, eventually Velo bugs. Like, a lot of the really good abilities are really in the second half of this particular archetype. If I was to make one change to this particular archetype, I just wouldn't make it forced to be sustains. But even then, it's so slow, And then you're just spending extra actions just to make this swarm do something, which is going to do not scaled damage very well and could potentially do an ability depending. Though it's like, then why didn't you just use a spell? Or why didn't you just archetype into a spellcasting archetype? It's just when you compare this, what it does to options for what your goals are, I feel like there are better options more often than not. Is Swarmkeeper cool? I like it. I think it's a fun one. I think it's really interesting. But is it effective? I feel like it's not nearly as effective as a lot of people would like. And I think what really puts an extra dampener on this takes up your animal companion slot. So an animal companion, which could have made this archetype feel better by just having another animal companion to do things, to give you some extra action economy on your round, to be like a true like manipulator style character, doesn't work unless you have Beastmaster, and even then it doesn't work quite the same. So yeah, I don't know. I'm sure everyone will let me know in the comments below what they think about the Stormkeeper. I like it. I really wanted to like it better. I feel like its early levels are very sad, and I feel like its damage scaling is very bad. Where the point of or not Aphid Flash, where the point of Bite and Sting just falls off. But maybe y'all have had some better ideas with it. Either way, that's gonna be it for me. Thank y'all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye.